Hi everyone. While it might sometimes feel like it, the research is not a solitary, separated activity. It is part of life, and in every research project, there are likely to be a group of people involved. Some people are there to evaluate the project. Some people must agree to be a part of the project. Some people must believe in the relevance of it. And hopefully there are also some people that are benefiting from the research results. Accountability should be our starting point, and to plan thoroughly and honor the systematique and rigor of academic research. The research proposal is part of this accountability story. Different people also then have different ideas or requirements about the format and the style of a research proposal. But all research proposals address the what, why, how, who, where, and when of a research project. If a project is clear in your head and clearly put in writing, the research proposal gives this cohesive picture of how all the parts of the study fit together. In this tutorial, we are looking at the research proposal, what the basic sections of a research proposal usually are, and how you can fit different studies into this basic format. We will also look at how you could potentially modify the research proposal to suit your own style or to suit a specific design of a project. A research proposal is a planning document that outlines the researcher's initial thinking about the project, what the research problem is, and how you plan to study it. It's important and useful for a researcher to conceptualize and be able to verbalize the logics and systematics of their proposed project, and it's a good indicator of whether you've done your proper reading and preparation. The proposal thereby gives the researcher the opportunity to refine their thinking and to attend to all the small details before actually starting off. Research proposals vary in style and length, but the basic idea is that a proposal is straightforward and clear and uncluttered and concise. And while the guidelines for each university or for each funding opportunity vary, you should be able to produce a good research proposal in less than 10 written pages. It's standard practice in academic research that a proposal precedes a research project. And for most postgraduate degrees, it's required to produce an accepted or acceptable research proposal before a student is allowed to continue with their work. For postgraduate students, the proposal is also the basis for their agreement with their supervisor. In other words, the student agrees to undertake the study as proposed, and the supervisor agrees to provide supervision for the study proposed. In social and human sciences, the research is bound to change during the course of the study. Many things won't happen as planned. The researcher and their ideas will evolve and develop, and especially in qualitative traditions, we need a certain amount of flexibility and adaptation to context. In every research project. This is to be expected, but it's important that the agreement between the supervisor and the student, or between the researcher and those that instructed the work, is renegotiated as changes happen. The proposal is mostly then forward-looking, but it will form the basis of the introductory section or chapter of the study. It's the same structure or components in the research proposal and in a chapter 1, for instance. Okay, so there are different ways to do this, but usually we must have the following components in a research proposal: a working title, the background and contextualization, the research problem, a preliminary review of the literature and the theoretical foundation, the philosophical position, the proposed methodology, the ethical considerations and expected limitations and problems, and some practical planning. In the first place, the working title. The title of a dissertation or a thesis or a journal article or other research project is the most searchable aspect of a study. and should capture the essence of the project and the core features while being as simple as possible. Ideally, a title is as short as 10 to 12 words. Now, at the onset of a project, formulating a title can be quite difficult, but as the study evolves, it will become easier as the research has more clarity of thought later on in the process. But in a research proposal, we construct a working or preliminary title. Now, I don't want to talk too much about introductions in general. The introduction to a research proposal must do what introductions usually do. The one thing that I want to point out here is that you should state the problem or the purpose shortly, already in the introduction of the proposal. You'll get to it later on in the document, but it's important that your reader knows from the very onset what you are proposing so that the rest of what they're reading is making sense. The contextualization or background sections are like the bigger picture sections of the research proposal. See, you are interested in a certain topic and already read and thought a lot about your study, but your reader has not. So giving a proper background and context, bring your reader or your examiner or evaluator into your line of thinking and into the study so that they can better understand what you want to achieve through your work and what your main argument and rationale for the research is. In this section, the researcher places the research problem or topic into a specific context, both like a real-life context and in terms of your field of study. For organizational research, the real-life type of context is usually given in terms of the organizational setting or the bigger industry or sector or type of organization that is relevant to this study. By placing the topic into the context of a real organization or other organizational setting, you can point out the relevance, importance, and need for your work. For example, you can point out that there is a rising interest or importance of a specific issue, or that there is a need to evaluate certain organizational practices, or there's a specific country or context or industry or organization that has not been sufficiently explored in previous research, or there are changes in communication needs that need to be looked at, or there's a need to analyze or describe or critique current or new policies in that setting. In this section, the researcher also places the study or the topic within a specific field, scholarly field. And they might outline the field and shortly highlight like the major debates or developments or hot topics or famous works in this field of study. The researcher can also use this disciplinary contextualization to provide a rationale for the research, broad reasons for choosing a specific communications phenomenon, and what the significance of this field of study is. You could point out things like how the research could contribute to the development of theory, or the construction of theoretical models or measuring instruments, or how it contributes to understanding relationships between specific theoretical variables. One important thing to remember while you are figuring out a rationale for your work is that you need to ensure that there is coherence. If you have a specific rationale here in the contextualization section about the relevance or importance of your study, let's say you argue that the COVID crisis forced us to revisit organizational communication practices. You should not change track later on. Maybe argue that your research is decolonial or Afrocentric because those communication practices have never been studied. Your line of argument must make sense throughout. Against the background, contextualization and rationale given in the previous section, the purpose of your proposed study should be clarified next. This is usually expressed as the research problem, and in the research problem section, the problem is discussed, summarized in a short statement, and then teased apart and unpacked.
Now in tutorial 3, we covered a lot of details on how to get from a topic to a research problem. And we talked about the way to describe your research problem. You might remember that you need to consider things like answerability, feasibility, scope, relevance, and other things related to your discipline or philosophical position. For your research proposal, you can use these considerations to motivate and delineate your research problem. From this discussion of the research problem flows your problem statement, or your purpose statement, or your issue statement, or your general aim statement, or your general research question. This statement is usually a clear, unambiguous, concise 1 or 2 sentence summary of what your study is about. It can also be formulated as like the main question your research intends to answer, like this. Here in a short version of a purpose statement, the purpose of this research is therefore to critically explore the management communication practices of organization X. And this is formulated as a statement of general aim. This researcher writes, to explore the applicable concepts that a CSR model should integrate to create a strategic advantage for the business, but also contribute to sustainable development. And this is an example of a general research question. How can safety information be efficiently communicated to employees at the Gautrain project? Now, some people prefer a simpler version of it, like the first example and the example of the research, the general research question. These are like simple formulations, not giving a lot of information. Others prefer a more complex formulation that gives a lot more detail, like the general aim statement example that has a lot more detail. Can you see that? What I also did is I transferred the first example into a more comprehensive version. So that's on your screen now as an example. The purpose or main issue of this decolonial research is to critically explore the management communication practices in Organization X by means of a historical analysis supplemented by interviewing lower-level employees of Organization X and a critical discourse analysis of management communication artifacts. So can you see that it's the same purpose? It's just a more comprehensive and a less comprehensive version of the statement. In many postgraduate studies, candidates will not use only one of these formulations, but will use more than one. They may state the problem statement and have a general research question and have a general aim for the study. The reason that we use more than one formulation of the problem is because it helps us to logically unpack the problem into specific objectives or sub-problems or research questions, like this. Can you see that this researcher formulated a problem statement there in section 1.2 and then formulated more specific kind of sub-problems, then formulated a general research question, unpacked in specific research questions, and then formulated a general research aim and unpacked from there the specific research objectives. This is all congruent with each other, but the different formulations help us to cover different aspects when we unpack the research problem. Now, depending on the specific study, we unpack the research problem by formulating like these sub-problems or sub-issues, specific research questions, hypotheses, specific research objectives. So whichever combination of these are relevant to your particular study, you will use one or more of these. We do this to break down the main issue into smaller components systematically so that we can know which specific things to focus on in order to eventually address the main issue. In the first place, most problem statements or purpose statements include a verb that denotes the aim or the objective of the study. Or if you formulate the general aim of your research, that statement of general aim will denote the overall aim or objective. And now you could have a general aim and more specific objectives for specific aspects of your work, or you can have more than one kind of parallel aims or objectives for your study on the whole. Here are some examples of aims and objectives we often use in organizational communication research projects. The first is exploratory objectives. This is for exploring a new area of research or a new situation or context, or trying to identify key concepts or key stakeholders or key needs pertaining to a specific communications phenomenon. Then there's the intention to gain understanding. This is if you set out to deeply understand and deeply delve into a specific communications phenomenon in order to understand people's experiences or to understand the phenomenon's processes or underlying structures or whatever your intention is to understand. Then there are descriptive objectives that are for describing the characteristics of a phenomenon in accurate detail, or for describing more like statistical relationships between variables. Next up is explanatory objectives. They are usually used for quantitative longitudinal studies or quantitative experimental type designs that explain cause and effect relationships specifically between variables, or like impact or effects or influence of one variable on another. Then we have evaluative objectives. They are usually associated with evaluative research designs, where the success or the outcomes of a communications campaign or a communications project is determined. Then there are critical objectives, the objective to critique. It's usually associated with critical or transformative research, and also then, of course, with a decolonial, post-colonial tradition. You set out specifically to critique existing theories or existing organizational communication practices through your work. Then you can be said to have critical objectives. Then there are sub-problems and specific research questions. This is about breaking down the main issue into smaller parts or smaller issues. So that's why we refer to sub-issues or sub-problems. And then research questions are specific research questions that are questions that need to be answered in order for the general research question to be answered or for the research issue to be addressed. So they are like a question breakdown of the main question or the main problem. To create sub-issues or specific research questions, we can focus on different things. Like we can focus on different demographic and socio-demographic characteristics of our study population. For instance, your main issue might be to explore how customers experience the social media marketing of organization X. Then your sub-issues or your specific research questions could focus on different demographic sections of the customer population. For instance, like sub-issue 1 can be to explore how customers between the ages of 18 and 25 experience social media marketing of organization X. And then sub-issue 2 could be to explore how customers between the ages of 35 and 50 experience social media marketing of organization X. So that is to making two sub-issues to explore two different like age categories in order to probably compare them or to interpret them together at a later stage towards understanding the fuller version of the main issue. Or if you had formulated specific research questions, it could have been, how do customers between the ages of 18 and 25 experience the social media marketing of organization X? And then research question 2, how do customers between the ages of 35 and 50 experience the social media marketing of organization X? So can you see that the sub-issues are formulated in the same style as the general purpose statement or problem statement? And a research question is formulated in the same style as like the general research question, but it's this smaller breakdown. You can also create different sub-issues or different specific research questions by featuring on by focusing on the unique features of your chosen organization or your chosen industry. Using the same example as above, here it could be like research question 1 could be, what are the characteristics of marketing communication in the financial services industry in South Africa? And research question 2, what are the characteristics of marketing communication of organization X as a financial services organization? So that is like two different layers of focus. The first is an industry focused research question, and the second is like a specific organization focused research question. So these two specific questions are then answered in order to give a fuller answer to the main issue. You can also focus on different aspects of your chosen communications phenomenon. For example, you can create a sub-issue that says to explore the unique features of social media marketing of organization X in comparison to its marketing communication efforts on the whole. So this research question is asking specifically about this one part of marketing communication and putting it into the bigger context of bigger marketing communications field on the whole. So that separation can also be a way to formulate specific research questions. Some studies make use of both sub-problems and specific research questions, but some only use one of the two, since they kind of fulfill the same purpose. For many researchers, it makes sense to formulate the problem statement with sub-problems, as well as a general research question with specific research questions, as each different style of breaking down the problem brings more clarity and specificity to the conceptualization of the study. Now, here are some examples of combined sub-issues and research questions and objectives like that. Like this first example, this doctoral student formulated a specific research question for each sub-problem, and they match each other exactly. So if we look at the first one, the sub-problem is to determine what the current proposed methods, models, or theory are for the internal organizational communication according to literature. And then the research question mirrors that exactly by asking, what are the current proposed methods, models, or theory for internal organizational communication according to the literature? So this is how this student decided to do it. Then there's another example. It could look like this. The student created a table to put these to display the alignment between the different aspects of the research problem. So in the first column, there are specific research objectives, and then the matching research questions are in the second column. This is also an interesting way to think about it. And here you can see that this person combines objectives and questions. And then in this last example, this person combines a general research question with specific research questions and a research aim and specific aims. So this is another example of, like the one above, using both research questions and research aims, but this is a slightly different unpacking. You can pause a little bit to look at the example in more detail. Now, more relevant for quantitative approaches, but if you are researching the relationship between different variables, these variables and the specific relationships you are intent on measuring should be specific in your problem section of the proposal. If your study on the whole is about the relationship between two variables, for instance, it could be stated as part of the problem statement already. But if it's only one aspect of your bigger study, you will probably formulate it as one of your sub-issues. We often see like this in mixed method studies, or like quantitative studies with multiple components, that one of the components is intent on measuring a relationship between variables, while another component could be descriptive or even exploratory. The formulation usually looks something like this when you are formulating this relationship between variables, to describe the relationship between work-life balance and the use of social media for internal communication, or to establish the correlation between communication satisfaction and media richness, or to evaluate the impact of remote working on communication effectiveness. Now, this last one is a cause and effect relationship. The second one is a correlation relationship. And the first one is like an undefined type of relationship, but it usually means it's a correlation intention when you just say describe the relationship between work-life balance and social media. That usually means correlation and not a causation like the last one. Now, to unpack this in more detail, we use hypotheses. Now, an hypothesis is a tentative statement about the relationship between these variables that will either be accepted or rejected by your research. This means that your hypotheses must be statistically testable. Hypotheses come from theory, in other words, it's aligned to quantitative research intent of testing existing theory. So a hypothesis is formulated from your theoretical understanding and then tested through your work and either accepted or rejected by the specific findings of your project. Hypotheses are usually formulated in pairs, like there's the research hypothesis or the alternative hypothesis, normally called H1, that states the expected relationship between variables, like as it is predicted or expected by the researcher based on theory. And then there's the null hypothesis, usually indicated by an H0, that is the opposite side, that states that there is no relationship between the variables. So it comes like this. These are examples. The research hypothesis here is there is a correlation between social media use and communication satisfaction. And then the null hypothesis is there is no correlation between social media use and communication satisfaction. Or it could be, in another example, there is a difference between the communication satisfaction of younger employees and older employees. And then the null hypothesis would be there is no difference between the communication satisfaction of older employees and younger employees. For instance, you can complete that by yourself. Your hypothesis can be used to test like correlation or covariance between variables. Correlation is in a specific direction, so it's either positively or negatively correlated. You can also test causation, as I've said earlier, and then also other types of variables. It depends on what your research objectives are and what is possible through your research. You might already know that for a lot of postgraduate studies, causation is a difficult thing to prove because we in social research, as like the same in organizational communication research as part of that, it's difficult to do a longitudinal work for postgraduate studies, and it's also very difficult in social research to set up experimentation work. So that is often avoided, but it's not impossible. So you must also think of what is feasible for your study to do before you delve into the formulation of specific hypotheses. Now, following the statements, the section stating and unpacking your research problem, the preliminary literature review and theoretical work is presented. You will do most of your literature review and theoretical reading before you are even able to formulate your research problem, but in the research proposal, they are sequenced, with the literature usually following the statement of the problem in the proposal document itself. A part of the planning phase of a research process that you cannot skip is doing your background reading on the theoretical side of your research and some preliminary reading on other research and related works in your area of study. In your research proposal, you provide evidence of this background reading or initial reading. Your initial theoretical and literature review should lead you to identify and conceptualize your key terms or concepts. As I said, you also need this initial understanding in order to formulate your research problem and research questions in a logical way. In the first instance, you must give background on the scholarly field and major theoretical literature and developments and debates in the field. You also need to describe existing theoretical models and theories that will inform your study and identify the specific concepts or variables from those theories that are relevant to your work. Those core concepts or variables need further theoretical exploration so that you end up with a theoretical foundation for your proposed work. Secondly, your research proposal should provide support for your proposed study and further illuminate and contextualize your core concepts or variables. This is done by a preliminary review of related research studies covering some of your concepts or variables, or is on a same or similar topic, or is in a similar study context. Based on these previous and related research, you can provide support for your study by highlighting the current state of knowledge, current gaps, like there's not a lot of relation, there's not a lot of research in a specific context or specific country on a specific topic, those type of arguments, and incorporate the arguments and methodologies and findings of other researchers into the conceptualization of your own study. Some researchers make theoretical assumptions or formulate guiding arguments or theoretical statements from their preliminary literature review and present this as part of their proposal and as a summary of the theoretical foundation of their work. Like here is an example of this doctoral student that formulated two theoretical arguments about corporate social responsibility and corporate social responsibility communication that she derived that from her literature work and that the rest of her study assumes to be true. So she says CSR has a dual purpose: to create strategic advantage for organizations as well as contribute to the sustainable development of society. And then in the second place, CSR communication should support this dual purpose by addressing both business and societal CSR communication in a mutually exclusive and integrative manner. So this is a summary of what her theoretical base will be. Here is another example of specific theoretical statements made in a research proposal. Theoretical argument 1. Organizations should be attentive to all their stakeholders by building and maintaining relationships with them. Theoretical argument 2, the society in which an organization operates is an organizational stakeholder and corporate social investment is an expression of business-society relationships. Theoretical argument 3, NPOs represent society in many respects and relate to corporate donors through corporate social investment. Theoretical argument 4, the relationship between organizations and NPOs is unique in many respects. Theoretical argument 5, the unique context of the relationship implies contextualized theory, measurement, and description. Can you see how these theoretical arguments are like a summary of what you will find in a literature review about corporate social investment, about stakeholder relationships, about non-profits and corporate donors, and that is what this study is about. And then these guiding arguments can help you think about the theoretical side of your study and is used in a research proposal to display and to give evidence of your theoretical argumentation. As I said in the background and contextualization part of this tutorial, a very important aspect of a research proposal is its scientific coherence. Now, this coherence is mostly about how the different aspects and decisions and motivations of a research project fit together with each other and also fit within the bigger framework of the researcher's philosophical position. now in tutorial 1 and 2, there's a lot more detail on philosophical positions and paradigmatic positions in a social research context, and from that we can see that certain conventions and research practices are associated with different paradigmatic positions. And if you jump between different lines of argument that are associated with different paradigms, your proposal will end up not being coherent. Now, sometimes the philosophical position is stated in the introduction of a research proposal and not specifically discussed in a separate section. In these instances, the entire proposal must speak of the stated position. So you show your position through your work, your language, your lines of argument, instead of discussing the position itself. However, sometimes it's useful to create a specific section in the proposal to set out your ontological and epistemological position so that the readers of your proposal can easily use the correct criteria to evaluate your proposal on. For example, if your study is interpretivist, it will signal a reader or an evaluator not to be looking for statistical procedures or generalization in your work. Then in the methodology section of the research proposal, we include details on the research approach, the research design, the specific research methods, populations and sampling for each method, the data collection processes and analyses. Basically, it's how you intend to conduct the research in a more practical sense. The research approach is like a basic indication of whether your research is, for instance, quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods, and what and how the approach fits with your general philosophical position and the specific research issue in question. Then there's your research design. It could be specifically labeled research design, such as a survey design or an ethnographic design, but it could also be like a detailed description of those key variables, approach to measurement and methods proposed. Each of your specific research methods should be discussed and motivated in the context of your bigger design. And if more than one method is used, the sequence of data collection and analysis should also be addressed. Your discussion should be angled on your design and your study, but you should be using methodological literature in your writing to provide support for the decisions you made. Also, for each specific research method, you have to outline the population and the population characteristics and the sampling methods and procedures. From your proposal, it must also be clear why a specific population is included and demarcated in a specific way that you propose it, and what the intended sample size is. Same as for the research design, you should focus on describing your population and sampling, but you should provide support and motivation for the suitability of your decisions and proposed processes by citing methodological literature. Also, for each specific research method, you should describe the data collection techniques and processes. It's important to detail the types of data you will collect through each method, the measuring instrument that will be used, how that measuring instrument will be conceptualized and designed, and what the practical process of data collection will look like the when, what, where, and how of data collection. Following from the data collection details, your proposal should also cover data analyses. What is the specific technique or method or methods you propose for data analysis? It's usually different for different specific research methods. And what are the process you envision for the analysis? It is not always possible to know in advance what data analysis will end up looking like, but you should display your understanding of your specific research methods and the data analysis procedures usually associated with these methods. For example, if you are collecting quantitative data via a survey questionnaire, you need to outline some of the statistical procedures and calculations that are considered appropriate. Or if you are proposing a qualitative method, let's say qualitative, in-depth interviewing, you should display a good understanding of the specific analysis method, let's say qualitative content analysis, that you will use to analyze the transcriptions of your interview data. Depending on the specifics of your proposed methodology, you need to address validity and reliability for the quantitative aspects and trustworthiness for the qualitative aspects. You can also use this discussion of validity, reliability, and/or trustworthiness to point out specific limitations of your proposed research. For every research project, we need to consider the ethical implications of our work systematically and comprehensively. In most tertiary institutions, there are also a set of ethical guidelines to follow, and you will most likely need to go through a formal process of getting ethical clearance or approval for your proposed research. Therefore, no research proposal should go without a section on the ethics of the proposed project. Different types of research have different ethical considerations, and you need to detail the important considerations of your own project and mention how you will address ethical problems or potential ethical problems. If there is a specific policy or code of ethics that you must adhere to, you should also stipulate how your study and process will adhere to it and how you will go about getting approval or compliance confirmation. Most proposals also contain a breakdown of deadlines or target dates for specific stages of the project, and if it's relevant, also cost estimates for each stage. For postgraduate students, this exercise is an important one, as most novice researchers underestimate the time and resources needed to complete, for example, a literature review or data collection, or even the practical process of applying and waiting for ethical clearance at your tertiary institution. Speaking of waiting, also remember to factor in the waiting periods for feedback from your supervisor or mentor throughout the process. Specifically for postgraduate dissertations and theses, students are required to provide a preliminary structure of their dissertation or thesis. Usually a tertiary institution will have a template or conventions for structuring postgraduate work, so check with your supervisor or study documentation for these guidelines. On the screen is an example of how a timeline and a chapter delineation was done in the same type of table setup. As I say at the beginning of the tutorial, the research proposal is mostly about the logic of the proposed project. And because there are various ways to approach and design research projects, there are some various ways in which a proposal can be structured. Now, we talked about a sort of standard format and sections up until now, but quickly I want to take you through some variations you might need to consider for your own study. There's of course the simple option of swapping or combining sections of the proposal. If for some reason, like following the generic structure of your research proposal is not fitting the arguments you want to make in your proposal, you could consider to swap around some sections or then to put them together. Like the first part of your research proposal usually takes the reader on your journey of transforming the research idea into a feasible research problem. This is done by the background, the rationale, the literature review, and the research problem sections. You could, for that matter, opt to rather do something like start with a problem statement and the unpacking of the problem, and then follow with the background and the literature. Or you can combine the context and background sections with the literature and theory sections into a substantial section right at the beginning of the proposal, so that your problem that comes in the next section then logically flows from your background and from your theoretical foundation. You can leave the rationale arguments out of the background and context sections, for instance, and combine the rationale with the unpacking of the research problem in the research problem section. These are just some ideas. Then the second part of your proposal addresses the kind of study that will be undertaken in order to provide acceptable answers or responses to the research questions and research problem. This is done by stating your paradigmatic position, your approach, and detailing the design of your research. Now, if this demarcation is not really working for you, you could consider like combining the paradigmatic position and the research approach or design sections so that you can use your philosophical position arguments to motivate some of your methodological decisions. So this integrated way might help you substantiate your arguments. Then, in the last part of your proposal, you describe the research process, like the sequence of events, the specific tools and techniques for measurement, the population and sampling, the data collection and analysis and interpretation, so on. Now, it's a bit riskier, but you also have the option to leave out certain details if you have a good reason to do so in terms of the research process. Here, I'm thinking about work that deliberately moves away from specific conventions or labels for their work, like we see in the decolonial tradition. This could be a good reason for leaving out certain sections that is traditionally included. But just remember that the criterion or the scientific rigor still needs to be proven or substantiated. So where you leave a component out of your research proposal, there must be no doubt in the mind of your readers why you did what you did. Then there are also like different ways in which the sections can be formatted. For instance, you might choose not to have your methodology section like in this sequence: approach, design, methods, population, sampling, data collection, and data analysis, but have approach and design together maybe, and then method 1, and then population, sampling, data collection, and analysis for that method, and then method 2 with population, sampling, data collection, and data analysis for that method all together. So the sequencing depends on what suits you best. Or you could opt not to have the literature review in the standard way, but maybe replace it with a more detailed conceptualization of each key concept. So then you cover the relevant theory and literature relevant to each key concept or variable in your study one after the other. Some people even choose to replace the section on related or previous research works with an annotated bibliography. So instead of summarizing it kind of in a narrative form, a short summary is given of each relevant publication to point out a specific context or topics or methods or so on that can also inform your study that was used by previous researchers. There's an example of this type of style on this. Then the methodology section. This is the most specific and concrete part of a research proposal. It's also a section with a lot of possible variations, as different designs need to be treated slightly differently. Still keeping with the standard format of the research proposal in general, let's look at some pointers for methodology sections for specific research designs. Now, this is methodological details you might want to consider for proposed survey research. In the first place, when you describe your research design, your survey design, motivate the survey as the preferred design, indicate the time dimension for your survey. Is it cross-sectional, longitudinal, before and after style? Indicate the type of survey, for instance, organizational survey, opinion poll, attitude survey, needs assessment, or whatever. Specify the data collection instrument and administration. Is it a self-administered questionnaire? Is it a structured interviewing or a survey of other data sources? And then specify the specific format, like is it an online questionnaire? Is it Microsoft Teams based interviews? Is it a mail survey or telephone interviewing? What those specifics are. Then, in terms of population and sampling, identify the population, like the size, the characteristics, and the sampling frame if it's relevant. Then the sampling strategy, is it a single stage, multi-stage, representative sample or not? Is it probability sampling, quasi-probability or non-probability sampling? And then the specific method and process, like what the method is, what the stratification is, if that is relevant, and a rigorous description of the procedure. And ending with the sample size and the process to determine this number, the sample size number. And if relevant, cover things like sampling error and level of confidence. Then instrumentation. Name and detail and motivate your instrument. Is it an existing or a modified or a new instrument? If it's an existing instrument or modified instrument, are there permissions to be obtained? What are the relevant modifications or combination of existing instruments if you are combining from different previous ones? And what are the design considerations and for the specific administration style of your survey. Then the variables of your study and relate the variables to the instrument, indicate the content sections in relation to the variables, and give examples of items if possible. And then the validity and reliability of the instrument and pilot testing details proposed. Then the administration process, the steps in administering the survey, the initiatives for follow-up and ensuring higher response rates, and timelines for the execution of this. This is like the data collection section, of course. And then data analysis and interpretation. Describe your coding, analysis methods and processes. Describe the plan for descriptive statistics, inferential statistics, or other analysis processes that are relevant. And link the analysis and interpretation proposed with answering your research questions or responding to sub-issues or hypotheses. And then describe the interpretation process. Then here are some things, some pointers you could consider for the methodological section if you are proposing a quantitative experimental research design. Now, firstly, the experimental design and the selection of participants. Here you define the type of experiment. Is it a true, classic, quasi-experiment? Is it a natural, non-equivalent, control group, time series, whatever the specific type of experiment is, and give an overview and motivation of this. And then the selection of participants. You describe the selection process for participants. Is it random or non-random, specific sampling methods used, and so on. Then are you making use of matching participants or not matching participants? And then you need to describe the groups and subgroups, like the experimental and control groups, size, calculation, and appropriateness of group sizes. Then the variables, specify the independent and dependent variable or variables, and describe the level of control you have over the variables in the specific experimental design. Then instrumentation and materials. Identify the instruments, like the development of instruments, the items, scales, reliability, validity, past uses, permission for existing instruments, depending on what it is exactly, and describe your use of instruments, like in pre-test, post-test, repeated testing, whatever, and the materials used for the experimental treatment, like what program or activities or materials will be given to people, and also is there a plan for a pilot test. You can also have a subsection for threats to validity, like identify the potential threats, like threats to internal and external validity and the implications of these threats, and responses to the threats, like how they will be avoided or minimized. And last, then the procedure is like the data collection procedure. Describe the process step by step, the sequence of events, and the details of each steps. You can, it's often used in experimental designs, a visual display of how the process is put together. And lastly, the data analysis and interpretation, like give an overview of the analysis and interpretation, the descriptive and inferential statistical calculations that will be used, the interpretation against research questions or hypotheses, and the interpretation against literature. Then if you are proposing a qualitative research project, you can also tailor your methodology section specifically to the things that is important to qualitative work. Now, there's a lot of similarity between different qualitative designs and qualitative studies, so I'll look at them kind of in a general sense. Now, firstly, some studies, it's important to identify the strategy of inquiry. Now, there are specific qualitative strategies like narrative, phenomenology, ethnography, case study, grounded theory, participatory action, research, discourse analysis, whatever that specific strategy or research design is. Then give background and motivation for the strategy and link the strategy to your research purpose and the research questions of your study. Then in a subsection you could discuss the role of the researcher, because in qualitative work that's always a relevant aspect to address, because qualitative work always has the researcher involved in the study subjectively and not separate and objectively as seen in quantitative work. So in terms of the role of the researcher, you could summarize your reflection by declaring your biases, your values, your personal background, and things that may shape your interpretation of data. And then declare connections between the researcher and participants, like is it backyard, personal type of connections, what are the power and status differences and other connection issues like that. And then issues of permission and access to the population and what the steps that are proposed to be taken, and the ethics and the sensitivities of getting access and permission to conduct the work. Then sample selection, identify the different sites or the different individuals or events or activities or artifacts to be sampled or selected, and describe the selection criteria and process and motivate the relevance of this for the particular study. Because sample selection in qualitative work is described differently than in quantitative work. In quantitative work, it's about population size, population characteristics, sample size, sample method, calculations, motivations, representation, generalizability. But in qualitative work, it is about a fuller, thicker motivation of why certain sampling methods are used and what are the process of selecting the participants or the specific artifacts or whatever you are sampling. Then data collection and recording. Identify and describe your data collection methods like observation, interviewing, focus groups, document or artifact analysis. Describe and motivate each method, like describing it maybe by the type of data, like specifying the type of interview or observation or artifact analysis that's going to be used. Discuss instrumentation, give the interview schedules, observation protocols or coding sheets, the ideas for those things and the considerations, and describe the recording of data, like what are your specific methods of recording, field notes, tape recordings, video recordings, reflective notes, journaling, whatever is suitable for your qualitative design. Then data analysis and interpretation. Each component of data analysis, the plan should be identified, like preparing different analyses, procedures, deeper processes of interpretation and representing the data, and then the overall interpretations. The process is usually flexible, so the flexibility that's built into it is also described, and then detailed steps taken in terms of coding and interpretation is usually unpacked. A systematic process must be followed. So it's things like what your code book is going to look like, software that's going to be used, how integration is going to happen, what the role of literature is, and so on. Then lastly, the trustworthiness. You motivate the trustworthiness of your proposed study by referring to the credibility, the transferability, the dependability, and the confirmability. These are all like the qualitative versions of validity and reliability. Then if you are proposing a mixed method study, there are also a specific way you can go about the methodology section. So on the screen, you can follow along. The first section is the specific mixed method strategy. So identify the specific strategy of the mixed method design, or the specifics of the design. Like what is the timing of it? Is it a sequential design or a concurrent design, for instance? What is the weighting? Is qualitative and quantitative equal or not? Is one supplementing the other? Is one confirming the other? What is the weight between them? And then what is the specific way of mixing? Like, is it integrating, connecting, embedding the qual in the quant, connecting the qual with the quant? Like, what is the specific way that you're going to go about mixing? And then motivate this choice of strategy and the strategic decisions made for your mixed method design. It's usually also appropriate to give a visual display of the research design and the sequencing of events. Then sampling and data collection could be another subsection. Identify the populations and data collection methods per phase of the study. Describe the sampling techniques and processes for each sample drawn. Give the specifics of each data collection method. Discuss the instrumentation of each and the data collection processes. That's generic, like standard type of details per research method in this mixed design. Then data analysis and validation. The data analysis process, and specifically the sequence of the analysis processes per your specific design, and then the data analysis techniques or methods used for each method, and then the specifics of interpretation. This is also more complex than in only qual or only quant studies, because different types of data will come together in some kind of interpretation. So how is this transformation, integration, comparison, and things are going to happen in the analysis and interpretation of the data? And what are the steps taken towards legitimization in the last place? So this is legitimization here is a combined word pointing to both the quantitative reliability and validity and the qualitative trustworthiness. All right, so that's it for this tutorial. I hope that what we covered here gave you a good idea of like the standard components of a research proposal, and then also like some inspiration in terms of if you have specific needs for your proposal, like what are your options for swapping around, for changing your proposals, subsections to suit your specific idea, your specific line of argument, or your specific research approach. So, all right, bye until next time.